Good morning and welcome. I'm Sarah Schaefer. I'm the Public Programs Facilitator here at the San Francisco Jung Institute. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You should know where the bathrooms are. There's one here just through the door to the right of that big table. There's one upstairs through the library. There's one downstairs in the basement if you're adventurous, and there's one all the way on the top floor through the near the air on the opposite end from the Air's Lounge, so on that end of the building. And we have lots of volunteers today who would be happy to help you find them. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Daniel Polikoff. He is a poet, translator, and internationally recognized Rilke scholar. He's well received. I'm very sick. I'm just going to share that with you. His well-received book on Rilke and archetypal psychology, In the Image of Orpheus, Rilke, A Soul History. This one available for sale here. Or for those of you joining us online, it's available on Amazon, this one. It appeared in 2011, and he recently published Sonnets to Orpheus, a new translation. So we're very excited. We're some of the first people to have access to this, and Dr. Polikoff's going to be drawing on this today. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Polikoff.
Thank you, Sarah, and I'd like to thank the Jung Institute for coordinating the event, as well as the Asheville Jung Center for making it available to a wider audience. And I'd also like to acknowledge Angelico Press and John Reese for making my new translation of the Sonnets to Orpheus available for us. I'm very excited that this book is out. I've been working on the sonnets on and off for a couple of decades, and some of you may have other translations of the sonnets, but I would suggest that a translation is itself a kind of a work of art. So I hope you'll enjoy the readings I do from it today. To give you a quick overview of how the program is going to run today, the presentation on the task of transformation, Rilke in the Hermetic tradition, will be in 3 parts. The first part is dedicated to Orpheus, the second part to Hermes, and the third part to Eurydice. And the first part should run about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a little break. The second part about the same, and perhaps a very brief bathroom break after that, and then we'll go into the last section. So good, let's get started. Are we okay technically? I think so, good. So the time is January 1912. The place is Duino Castle on the shores of the blue Adriatic, a few miles west of Trieste in Italy. The ruins of the old Duino Castle are nearby. It's a storied place. Dante is reputed to have written part of his Inferno there. But it's another poet who brings us to this scene today, namely Rainer Maria Rilke, who is sojourning at Duino, visiting his great friend and patroness, the Princess Marie von Thurn und Taxis, Hohenlohe. I practiced a long time to get that name right. She's a member of the old nobility, which is soon to be no more after the Great War, which is imminent, of course, at the time. Rilke is going through a somewhat difficult passage in his life. After finishing his brilliant but agonized novel, The Notebooks of Malta Lorid's Brigga, a couple of years before, Rilke was struggling to find the next step on his soul's path. And today we find him pacing at the bastion of the foot of Duino Castle, having received difficult business letter and contemplating how he is to respond to this matter. He's pacing atop the limestone cliffs that plummet hundreds of feet down to the blue Adriatic, walking back and forth, when out of the stiff north wind, a voice speaks to him. Wer, wenn ich schrie, hörte mich denn aus den Engelordnungen? Who, if I cried, would hear me then among the angelic orders? Rilke knew it was the voice of the god, or the muse, or the angel that had spoken. He went inside. What do you think the first thing is that he did? He wrote that business letter, got that out of the way, and then turned to his real work. And by the end of the day, 2 of the great Duino elegies had been completed, along with fragments of several others, and Rilke had also conceived a vision of the gestalt of the whole cycle, the 10 great elegies that were to make up the Duino elegies, which he immediately came to regard as his magnum opus, the great work that would fulfill his high poetic calling. Despite the promising beginning, however, Rilke's work on the elegies hardly went smoothly. In fact, Rilke was not able to make much more progress on them until a couple of years later, when he wrote the difficult 4th elegy in 1914 in Munich. Still, because of inward and outward circumstances related to World War I, Rilke was unable to make any further progress on the elegies for a long time. He did finish the cycle, but it took him an entire decade to do so. The elegies were not finished until Rilke was living in Switzerland after the war, in a small town near Sierra, which is right on the linguistic border of French and German-speaking Switzerland. There he was residing in a little miniature castle called the Chateau Musot, and it was there in February of 1922 that he was finally able to finish the elegies in a remarkable burst of inspiration. That burst of inspiration, however, was catalyzed by the totally unexpected advent of another work, which, so to speak, jump-started the resumption of work on the elegies. That work is another great work, the sonnets to Orpheus. Now, the sonnets have a very different creation story than the elegies. Rilke had labored decades to try and finish the Duino cycle, but the sonnets came to be, so to speak, whole, all at once. The 55 sonnets written, as I will detail later, in a very short time. Although unplanned, however, the sonnets were not exactly unprepared. During the war, Rilke had been translating the sonnets of Michelangelo from Italian and regarded that work as his most constant occupation during the wartime. He'd finished that project a scant month before writing the sonnets to Orpheus, and the work on the sonnet form must have been a kind of preparation for the writing of the sonnets to Orpheus. But much more important, decisive even, was Rilke's relationship to a young woman by the name of Vera Ukama Knoop, distant as though that relationship was. Rilke had been a friend of the Knoop family before the war in Munich, and Vera, at that time a very young girl, was a playmate of Rilke's own daughter, Ruth. Unfortunately, Vera contracted a blood disease and died at the young age of 19. She had been, in her short life, a beautiful, wonderful dancer, which is part of the story, of the background story of the sonnets. Rilke had learned of her death a couple of years before, but didn't send his condolences to Vera's mother, Gertrude, until the occasion of his own daughter Ruth's engagement in late 1921. And when he did so, a correspondence sprang up between Gertrude, Knoop, and Rilke, which resulted eventually in Gertrude sending Rilke a priceless gift, namely the gift of Vera's diaries, which documented most movingly the last days of her life as her death, her inevitable death, I think it was from leukemia, though I'm not sure, approached. Rilke was profoundly stirred by Vera's diaries, what she found therein. And in a letter expressing gratitude to Gertrude for this precious gift, he elaborated what he understood to be the two outermost boundaries of her, that is Vera's, pure intuition. And I quote, "This, that suffering is an error, a dull misapprehension arising from the physical that drives its stony wedge, into the unity between heaven and earth. And, at the other extreme, the oneness of her wide open heart with the existing and enduring world, this ascent to life, this joyous, impassioned communing to the very last moment with her native earth. Ah, with only the earth? Nay, and this she could not know in these first attacks of breakup and parting, with the whole, with much more than the earth. Oh, how she loved, how she reached out with the antenna of her heart beyond all that can be grasped or encompassed here." This short quote says volumes about the vision that informs the sonnets to Orpheus, and it's quite clear that Vera became the Eurydice figure, or transformed into the Eurydice figure that accompanies our archetypal poet, Orpheus, through the sonnets. But the relation to Vera was not the only Orphic prompt that helped prepare Rilke for the writing of the sonnets. The Christmas before, his lover, the artist Balladina Klazowska, had gifted Rilke a copy of Ovid's Metamorphosis, actually a French translation of that work, which of course includes the classic account of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. In addition to that, Merlin also provided a visual image that provided a crucial point of departure for Rilke's sonnets. But before telling the story of that image, it's important to know, for the purposes of this talk, that the sonnets would not represent the first time that Rilke had written a major poem based on the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. In fact, it was not even the first time that he wrote a poem inspired by a work of art on that subject. Let's flash back for a moment to 1904. That date finds Rilke living in Paris. He's apprenticed himself to the great sculptor Auguste Rodin, acting indeed for a time as his secretary, but also studying very closely Rodin's aesthetics, which then births Rilke's great early work, the New Poems. Now, during this time, Rilke was immersed in the visual arts, and at a visit to the Louvre, he saw an ancient bas-relief of Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes, and that's this image that I have framed here. And this image, who do you think is Orpheus and who do you think is Hermes in this image? I originally thought, well, this is actually Orpheus, and this is Hermes, and that's Eurydice. And it's thought to be depicting the moment just after Orpheus has looked back, and Eurydice once more has to retreat into the underworld. This image is especially important for this talk because it does introduce not one or two, but three archetypal figures around whom this whole presentation is structured. Orpheus, Eurydice, and Hermes. And by way of introduction to this cast of characters, I want to read a little bit of the poem, not the beginning, but a quick character sketch of each of those three figures. First, Orpheus. In front, the slender man in the blue cloak, mute, impatient, looking straight ahead. In large, greedy, unchewed bites, his walk devoured the path. His hands hung at his sides, tight and heavy, out of the falling folds, no longer conscious of the delicate lyre which had grown into his left arm like a slip of roses grafted onto an olive tree. He said to himself, they had to be behind him, said it aloud and heard it fade away. If only he could turn around just once, then he could not fail to see them, those other two who followed him so softly. The god of speed and distant messages, a traveler's hood above his shining eyes, his slender staff held out in front of him, and little wings fluttering at his ankles, and on his left arm, barely touching it, she. She walked beside the graceful god, her steps constricted by the trailing grave clothes, uncertain, gentle, and without impatience. She was deep within herself, like a woman heavy with child, and did not see the man in front, or the path ascending steeply into life. This passage is important because it introduces our three characters also in a particular guise. That is, in this figuration, each of the characters is, so to speak, in their own world. They're somewhat detached from one another in the course of their journey. It's also worth noting that Rilke's treatment of Eurydice in this poem is really quite revolutionary, because up to the time of this poem, in treatments of the myth, Eurydice had always been addressed as more or less of a foil for Eurydice. And this is one of the first works of art in most any genre that really gives Eurydice herself substance and weight. In fact, she becomes, in this poem, more central than Orpheus. And Rilke makes an attempt to depict her consciousness upon her shortly after her descent to the world of shades. In contrast to Eurydice's deep consciousness, the Orpheus of this poem is in effect all too human. He's riven by desire for the lost Eurydice. And predictably, the end of the poem rehearses then the second, and this time irrevocable, loss of Eurydice, and gives us a further sense of the characterization of Orpheus and Eurydice and their relationship in this poem. So I'll read the end. She, Eurydice, was no longer the woman with blue eyes who once had echoed through the poet's songs, no longer the wide couches sent an island, and that man's property no longer. There you see the very kind of novel treatment of Eurydice, almost feminist treatment. She was already loosened like long hair, poured out like fallen rain, shared like a limitless supply. she was already root. And when, abruptly, the god put out his hand to stop her, saying, with sorrow in his voice, "He has turned around," she could not understand, and softly answered, "Who?" Far away, dark before the shining exit gates, someone or other stood whose features were unrecognizable. He stood and saw how on the strip of road among the meadows, with a mournful look, the god of messages silently turned to follow the small figure already walking back along the path, her steps constricted by the trailing grave clothes, uncertain, gentle, and without impatience. And I'd like to thank Stephen Mitchell for his translation of that poem. Always have to give the translator their due. Now, back to the sonnets. The Orpheus image that in part inspired the sonnets is drawn from a different moment of the Orpheus myth, one that features not a triad of figures, but just Orpheus, or perhaps more accurately, Orpheus, a tree, and the animals. An excursion to nearby Sion, Rilke and Balladina Klazowska came across a postcard of the Renaissance painter Cima di Conigliano's drawing of Orpheus. And that is the drawing that you'll see on the cover of the book here. Merline purchased, or Balladina, Rilke often called her Merlina, purchased the postcard and tacked it up above Rilke's writing desk in the Chateau de Museau, where it hung some months after Merlina's own departure. And it was there in February of 1922 when Rilke received the inspiration to compose the sonnets. In fact, the very first poem of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus is, like Orpheus Eurydice Hermes, an ekphrastic poem. Does everyone know what that means? Yeah, it's a poem based on a painting or a visual image. And the image that is poetically rendered here is, of course, Cima di Conigliano's drawing. And I am going to read this first sonnet to Orpheus in my own translation, all of them during this talk. A tree rose up, O pure transcendence, O Orpheus sings, O tall tree in the ear, and everything hushed. Yet in that quiet cadence, new transformations were beginning to appear. Creatures of calm thronged out of the clear, freed forest, out of nest and den, and it so happened that it was neither fear nor cunning that made them quiet then, but listening. Growl and roar, shriek and hiss seemed small inside their hearts. And where there had been barely a hut to receive all this, a lean-to made of darkest love and fearing, with an entrance that shivers in the air, you built them temples deep inside their hearing. This is a rather different Orpheus than the one in Orpheus Eurydice Hermes, and not only because it's a different moment in the myth. And this Orpheus is not so much a human being riven by desire, but more of a divine singer whose music almost magically confers a kind of preternatural calm upon the scene. In this respect, the opening lines of the sonnet present a kind of remarkable contrast with the opening of the twin work, the Duino Elegies, the completion of which the sonnets enabled. And let me tell very briefly the story of the chronology of the coming to be of these great works. On February 2nd at Museau, February 2nd, 1922, Rilke received the inspiration that led to the writing of the first part of the sonnets, and he composed, more or less without break, 25 of those 26 sonnets in a matter of about 3 days. Then, the flood of inspiration carrying forward, he turned to the elegies and finished the entire cycle, writing well over half the work. I think 4 or 5 of the elegies from whole cloth, and finishing other portions of others that were incomplete at the time. Then, after completing that in the course of a week, unexpectedly, the flood of inspiration for the sonnets returned, and he wrote the second part of the sonnets, all 29 of part 2 of the sonnets to Orpheus, in a matter of days. This all transpired then in the matter of about 3 weeks, from February 2nd to February 22nd, and represents one of the most astonishing bursts of creative inspiration and production in certainly the history of literature. Has anyone here written a sonnet? If anyone has, or even if you've just read them, you know how difficult the form can be. And to think about writing 55 sonnets, Rilke called it a dictation. And he said that he hardly changed a word in the sonnets. So it really was, which is just about the only way you could imagine writing that number of sonnets in that amount of time, not to mention five Duino elegies. So it really was a godsend, a kind of revelation that birthed these twin works. The elegies and sonnets do represent the consummation of Rilke's work, his literary career, and deep affinities do mark the vision that informs the two works. At the same time, as the opening of the works indicate, they're quite profoundly different poems. And I'd like to close the first segment of the talk by reading a few pages which focus on the contrast between the elegies and the sonnets, and that will provide a foundation for the rest of the talk. So bear with me for a while. This will take about 15-20 minutes. Given that the sonnets and elegies may be regarded as twin births, it's natural that Rilke should consider them deeply kindred poems. When the Polish translator of the Duino cycle requested assistance in understanding some of that work's obscurities, Rilke responded, "I am amazed that the sonnets to Orpheus, which are at least as difficult, filled with the same essence, are not more helpful to you in the understanding of the elegies." Indubitably, the elegies and sonnets do traverse shared territory. Inevitably, both engage the archetypal issues of love, death, beauty, and creative transformation that preoccupied Rilke his entire life. At the same time, salient features do set the poems distinctly apart. Indeed, in many respects, it would be hard to imagine two more dramatically contrasting exemplars of poetic art. Nor is it overly difficult to see relevant contours of contrast. They're evident, and rather spectacularly so, right from the start. During the seed time of the elegies, Rilke had steeped himself in scriptural sources, especially the Bible and a new adventure for him, the Quran. Commensurately, the voice that speaks the elegies rings in prophetic tones resonant with religious echoes. As August Stahl points out, the opening lines of the elegies, "Who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angelic orders," recalls Psalm 130, the famous De Profundis. In the King James Version, the psalm begins, Out of the depths I have cried unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let thine ears be attentive to the voice of my supplication. Noteworthy, as Stahl remarks, is the way Rilke's text permutes, even as it alludes to, the psalm. Both elegy and psalm commence with an I who cries out or consciously decides not to, and a putative addressee who is or is not presumed capable of hearing. Strikingly, the elegy's renunciation of the call or cry marks a rift, a seemingly unbridgeable gulf between the human and the divine. The poem continues, and even if one of them, an angel, took me suddenly to heart, I'd be consumed in his more powerful being. But that predicament is wholly incommensurate with the confident and trusting tone that ultimately prevails in the psalm, which ends, "Let Israel hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is mercy, and with him is plenteous redemption, and he shall redeem Israel from all his iniquities." Indeed, Rilke's elegiac opening, his poem's heart-wrenching lament of alienation from spiritual being, may well be heard to be far closer in tenor to another biblical passage of later vintage. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Consequently, the whole prodigious cycle of elegies devotes itself to finding some means of overcoming the crippling cleavage between human and angelic realities and all its potent corollaries, earthly and heavenly existence, time and eternity, visibility and invisibility, life and death. Turn now to the opening of Rilke's sonnets. A tree rose up, O pure transcendence, O Orpheus is singing, O tall tree in the ear, and everything hushed. Immediately, we enter an altogether different poetic universe. No gigantic Vatic gesture, rather a series of short, quick brushstrokes. No existential angst couched in sweeping rhetorical question, rather a straightforward declarative, followed by three brief apostrophes that double as celebratory exclamations. We encounter a poem then keyed to a tone of praise of what is present, rather than distressed lament of what is not. No manifestly human voice hurls itself despairingly into the void, hoping that its own energy will somehow conjure meaning out of the empty reaches of unresponsive cosmic space. Instead, we experience no patently human subject at all, but rather mythic events and imaginal presences, a tree arising and Orpheus singing, and the animals gathering around. And the poet speaks, a tree rose up, O Orpheus sings. If we listen attentively to that voice, if we allow ourselves to be transported by its sense-filled sound and so enter the temple of hearing erected for us, our soul, released from the spell that binds it to unimaginative realities, becomes part of the enchanted circle drawn toward its Orphic center. Then, and only then, will we have begun reading the poem, and so find ourselves in the presence of a God who, reclining under a tree, is singing with ineffable sweetness, singing, one could almost say, if it didn't seem somehow redundant or out of place, like an angel. What a difference from the bleak world evoked by the initial cry, a cry we do hear, even if it is ostensibly withheld, of the elegies. At the outset of that poem, we're buffeted by winds of despair as we enter a world fallen steeply away from any sense of that wholeness or connection that lends meaning to the universe. We feel our all too human self separated out, alone in the midst of nowhere and nothing. Well, almost nothing. For in this poem, too, a tree is the first actual thing that we are given to see. Alas, whom then can we turn to in our need? Not angels, not human beings. And the knowing animals somehow recognize that we're not really at home in our constructed world. There remains for us, perhaps, some tree on a slope that we are given to see again each day. In the drafty world of the elegies, this tree, which we see every day, is, at the outset at least, the closest we come to companionability or intelligibility, to the world making any sort of meaningful sense at all. But what poor sense this is. It's rooted in no deep ground, no real kinship or cosmic relatedness, but solely upon the fact of dull repetition, that we may, as another morning soul once put it, see that same tree again tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. The tree of the sonnets, on the other hand, is dramatically different matter. It's a tree that spontaneously arises in and through the invisible interiority of the world of sound. O tall tree in the ear. And if you look at the image, that image will be a little less strange, because you see how the tree actually kind of seems to rise out of Orpheus's ear in the Cima di Canigliano drawing. And thus, that tree, like the animals, bears witness to the transformative power of song that works marvelous change upon the face of the world. The opening scene of the elegies is one full of restless disquiet, agonizing tension born of all the cleavages that define its metaphysical backdrop. The first scene of the sonnets, on the other hand, unfolds a picture of peace, an image of the magical tranquility epitomized by animals emerging from the forest to listen to the singer. Excuse me. Classically, think for a moment of Aesop. Animals symbolize the motive and emotive energies instinct in the natural desires of the soul. These include formidable forces of aggression, fear, self-serving, cunning, and the like, which function as the origin of strife and unrest in the soul, especially, of course, when they're wild. The magic of Orpheus's song is that it brings the potentially unruly forces of soul into order, attunes them to a cosmic harmony that underlies creation as a whole, a beauty which reminds them of their divine origins. In stark contrast to the rifts and divisions underlying the universe of the elegies, the initial Orphic topos reveals a confluence of divine and natural worlds, a coming together of earthly and heavenly, or temporal and eternal dimensions of being, a healing and holy communion of body, soul, and spirit. Everything hushed, writes the poet, as we are ushered into the world of Orphic song. Within man, writes Emerson, is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. How are we to construe these momentous differences between Rilke's two late masterpieces? We might start by acknowledging that their apparent coincidence of origin may well be a bit misleading. After all, the conception, if not the completion, of the elegies did precede that of the sonnets by a full decade. And here I mentioned some critics of Rilke who acknowledge that the sonnets really belong in a more fundamental way to a later stage of Rilke's development, including August Stahl, who writes, "That which in the sonnets is recommended as the ideal, namely to be and at the same time to know the conditions of non-being, is present in the elegies in the form of as yet unattained reconciliation of the opposites." I would concur with this view, though with a slight modification. The sonnets, in my opinion, do not only recommend as an ideal the achievement of a consciousness that reconciles and thus transcends the metaphysical polarities that underlie human existence, being and nothingness, life and death, time and eternity, spirit and matter, heaven and earth, masculine and feminine, divine and human being. Rilke's sonnets emerge out of, abide in, and poetically manifest exactly that extraordinary, that whole and hallowed state of mind. And those words are from the sonnets themselves, Sonnet 19, whole and hallowed. Of course, the sonnets make perfectly clear that such consciousness cannot be understood as any sort of static state at all, but rather as an unending act of creative transformation. Even so, just this accomplishment, the ongoing realization of this quintessentially imaginative consciousness, is the pure transcendence announced at the beginning of the poem. Just this habitation in the Doppelbereich, the double realm, Sonnet 1:9, just this creative agency continually moving between worlds, changing the face of things as it goes, this constant power of metamorphosis, which is innate in and indeed the very essence of poetry, art, and song, just this, as Rilke's fifth sonnet tells us, is the God to whom the sonnets are addressed. Just this is Orpheus. All this doesn't go very far in explaining much about the sonnets. Rather, the interpretive gesture here is more one of pointing toward a mystery, the true depth of which, like that of all true mysteries, can't be explained. In this spirit, I want to close this part of this brief introduction with a couple of further indications. And here I go on to talk about how the elegies, and especially the sonnets, really represent the consummation of a long alchemical path of soul-making in Rilke's career. And that while on one level each of the sonnets and the sonnets as a whole are a completely realized work of art, they also in a certain sense depend on all that has gone before. The whole odyssey of soul that I document in my big book, Rilke, A Soul History, and the conjunctio that we find manifest in the sonnets, the greater conjunctio, is really the last stage of a whole series of coagulatios and solutios and negrettos and so forth that mark Rilke's long soul journey. So then I want to finish with one kind of further insight into that first sonnet. In accord with the aforementioned allusion to Rilke's arduous spiritual odyssey, I'd offer that the trajectory of his life and work may be broadly construed on the model of the archetypal hero journey Joseph Campbell so artfully delineates in his classic book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. The gist of the relevant plot line's simple, and Campbell himself sums it up in 3 words: departure, initiation, return. The hero leaves the human community into which he's born, undergoes trials and tribulations that secure him knowledge of dimensions of being beyond the pale of ordinary existence, and finally returns to the human world bearing and sharing the fruit of his travail. In connection with these motifs, Campbell speaks too of a sacred place, the symbolic center of the universe. And this is a quote, "The tree of life, that is, the universe itself, grows from this point," he declares, adding that the tree is rooted in supporting darkness, even while the light of the sun typically streams through its crown. In a related essay, Campbell associates this biblical tree of life with other hugely significant archetypal tree images: the Bo tree, under which Buddha attained enlightenment, and the holy rood. All qualify as emblems of what Campbell christens the world navel, the spiritual origin and end of the universe, which is also, insofar as it holds the key to all spiritual renewal, the alpha and omega of the hero journey. Campbell: "For the hero, as the incarnation of God, is himself the navel of the world, the umbilical point through which the energies of eternity break into time. Thus, the world navel is the symbol of the continuous creation, the mystery of the maintenance of the world through that continuous miracle of vivification which wells within all things. Da stieg ein Baum. A tree rose up," wrote or transcribed Rilke. Orpheus playing and singing as he leans up against the trunk, the place where root and crown meet, of that tall tree in the ear. This is one more image of this same symbolic center of the universe, that unheard center, Sonnet 228, that is, too, the intersection of inner and outer worlds in the temple of the ear, the invisible universe of sound. Having been given the gift of Rilke's sonnets, it's our deep privilege to listen in to the poem, to listen and to see what we can hear of the primordial mystery. So that's the end of the first part of the talk, and we can take a brief break here. I'll be willing to take a few questions, though, at this point. I want to reserve a longer question session for the end, but if there are any questions that are pressing brought up by what I've already said, we can spend just a few minutes to respond to those. If not, we'll just take a break. Yes?
What was his age then when he did the elegy, and then 10 years later?
So Rilke was born in 1875. So the inception of the elegies is 1912, when he is then 37. Okay, and 10 years later, he's 47. And Rilke actually himself dies at an unfortunately young age. He dies in 1926 at the age of 51. You know, he had a sense that and he also died of leukemia in a way that medically I don't know if it's clear if it was or was not related to what killed Vera Ukama-Knoop, but in a way their destinies were parallel. Rilke had a sense that when he completed the elegies and sonnets that he had fulfilled his mission. And although he had wrote quite a bit after that time, they're generally regarded as the consummations of his career. Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, definitely. I wrote many of them kind of initially in with some inspiration to do so, and then you grow more and more dissatisfied and change and more dissatisfied specifically with the way that, you know, it's not quite faithful to the sense of Rilke. But as you may hear, you know, I did want to try and reproduce Rilke's rhythm, his music, his metrics, and his rhyme schemes. So that makes it all the more challenging to be faithful to the sense. Many translations are not, of the sonnets aren't rhymed and or even strictly metered. Mine are. But yes, they've undergone many evolutions. And I'm still not 100% happy with all of them and never will be. There's only one solution for that, and that is to learn German. But I think they're a pretty good second. Any other questions for them? Great. So let's come back in you know, between 5 and 10 minutes and continue. Okay. So for this part, this is dedicated to the winged god Hermes. And accordingly, you have to buckle your seat belts for this part of the talk. It's going to be a little more theoretical, but just so you know what's ahead, the last portion of the talk dedicated to Eurydice will be about half reading the sonnet. So if we get through the second one, we'll be golden. Okay. Okay, and everyone has this because this is your, might be a little lost without my crude sketches of the cosmos here. All right, so 2, Hermes. So how are we then to construe the difference between the elegies and the sonnets? I think in order to do so, we need some kind of larger framework. And to supply that, I want to draw upon the ancient wisdom offered by another of the triad of our mythic figures, that is Hermes, fount of the so-called Hermetic tradition. Of course, Hermes himself is no simple character, and as befits his archetypal nature, a certain duplicity attaches to the character. The Hermes most familiar to us is that of the Greek god, a god of all kinds of movements between, god of messages, passages, crossroads, language, trade, and much else. But there's another Hermes too, certainly related in every which way to the Greek god, and yet also distinct, and that is Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes, avatar perhaps of the ancient Egyptian god Thoth or Thoth, and legendary author, for instance, of the Emerald Tablet, which many view as the kind of primordial text of alchemy. And it's the legacy of this figure, perhaps, even more than that of the Greek god, although, as I say, they are almost inseparable, that lends the Hermetic tradition its name and its heritage. One of the founding texts of this tradition, perhaps the founding, is the so-called Corpus Hermeticum, which is a text that came out of obscurity in the Renaissance. It was one of the texts that Marsilio Ficino discovered and in part translated, and helped kindle the Renaissance itself. And it was originally attributed at that time to Hermes Trismegistus. That was part of the magic and the allure of these ancient texts, who was at the time thought to have been an ancient sage who lived at the time of Moses. Later, it was established that the text of the Corpus Hermeticum, which originally the text that Ficino had on hand, I believe, was in Greek, and he translated it. It was later proven to actually have been written in the early centuries of the Christian era. The Corpus Hermeticum consists of, and there's a very nice edition of it translated and introduced by Brian Copenhaver. The Corpus Hermeticum consists of 18 treatises. And I stress that while they're certainly philosophical, metaphysical in tenor, they're also quite visionary. There's a strong mystical tenor to them, and they devolve from the aim towards what I think can best be called a kind of gnosis, a visionary participation in the divine sources of wisdom. And the treatise that I want to draw upon to help us on our way in understanding how can we really kind of construe this dramatic difference between the elegies and the sonnets, at least in their openings, is treatise number 11, which is titled Mind or Nous to Hermes. It's worth noting that the Corpus Hermeticum represents a quite novel blend of Greek philosophy, biblical culture, and ancient Egyptian mystery wisdom. And you find strains of all those streams of thought interwoven in it. It's a quite fascinating work. And as is in accordance with the Greek roots of it, the mind that is referred to in the title really is the nous, which is the fount of all archetypal intelligence in the Greek model. It's the divine mind, so it's not mind with a small m, but the divine mind that is teaching the mythical sage Hermes Trismegistus in the dialogue. And I want to launch us by reading from the very beginning of this text, Mind or Nous to Hermes, which finds Hermes himself addressing the nous or mind, who then teaches Hermes. Since people, this is Hermes, since people have said many contradictory things of all sorts about the universe and God, I have not learned the truth. Make the truth plain to me, Master. It is you alone on whom I may depend to reveal it. How do you dramatize the nous? I don't know. Mark my words, then, Hermes Trismegistus, and remember what I have to say. I will not hesitate to speak what occurs to me. Hear how it is, then, with God and the universe, my child. And now you may want to have these available as you follow the teaching of the nous. But listen, first of all, and then we'll refer to the little scheme. God, eternity, cosmos, time, becoming. God makes eternity. Eternity makes the cosmos makes time. Time makes becoming. The essence of God is wisdom. The essence of eternity is identity. Of the cosmos, order. Of time, change. Of becoming, life and death. But the energy of God is mind and soul. The energy of eternity is permanence and immortality. Of the cosmos, recurrence and counter-recurrence. Of time, increase and decrease. Of becoming, quality and quantity. Eternity, therefore, is in God. The cosmos in eternity, time in the cosmos, and becoming in time. So that's a mouthful, to be sure. Hermes here presents what is at one and the same time an ontological, epistemological, and cosmological scheme that's reminiscent in certain ways of what Plato lays out in the famous divided line that leads up to the parable of the cave. And indeed, Hermes' teaching can be diagrammed in a manner commensurate to the way that Plato's divided line is often diagrammed as a kind of graded ladder of different levels of being and cosmological and epistemological knowledge. And that's what I've done on the sheet here. Although it's noteworthy perhaps that to make it conform to the archetypal fourfold, I put God as a transcendent term to the left rather than one of the rungs of the ladder. And those rungs or levels then consist of the primary term that Nous mentions: eternity, cosmos, time, becoming. And then in turn, if you can read my scribbly writing, I have the attributes of those different levels indicated below them. Now, to try and get a somewhat more concrete or tangible sense of the scheme, I've also on the right made specific cosmological correlates of levels of the universe with these different levels of being. If we think of eternity, what in the universe typically represents eternal being? The stars, right? The undying stellar sphere. If we think of the cosmos as a whole and principles of order, especially the recurrence in the regular revolution of the planetary orbs, I think what we think of is the solar system and the planets in revolution around the sun. And I've symbolized that on that second highest level. And if we think about time and the sphere of change, of increase and decrease in a cosmological sense, well, we have the waxing and waning of the moon as the most evident instance of change in the astronomical cosmos. And if we think of the realm of becoming, of life and death, the quality of individual things and their number, many or few, we think of life on Earth, the coming into being and passing away of individual creatures and entities, and the transformation that is occurring perpetually on the Earth. So I've diagrammed that a bit to just kind of fill out our sense of this cosmic background. Well, all that's well and good, but what about the human being, the individual? Now, Hermes' assumption tacitly is that the individual human being participates through its soul in all these levels of the cosmos. At the same time, I think it needs to be acknowledged that the empirical human being, the individual subject of experience, doesn't really as yet have a discrete place, a dedicated niche, so to speak, in this scheme. You could ask, well, why not? I mean, isn't it fairly obvious on one level that we as human beings, at least the mortal part that we're most familiar with, would be identified with the world of becoming, with life and death? I mean, we're born, we live, we die and pass away, so we're part of that process. Well, certainly that's true, but in my kind of interpretation of this cosmology, I really want to kind of reserve our understanding of this realm of becoming for, in the first place, not the individual, but the earth itself. And that means the whole earth. And this harkens back to some degree to that citation I read from Vera Ukama Knup's diaries when he refers at first to the earth and how Vera loved the earth, but even more than the earth, the whole. And when I think of the earth, I'm thinking of indeed the whole earth, the consciousness that holds the totality of events in the world of becoming, something like the soul of the earth or the anima mundi, that's the very ground of the life and death of all individual beings. And to clarify this, suggest a couple of further correlates. First of all, that as Hermes himself teaches, the levels of the cosmos are not entirely discrete, but they participate and are nested one in the other, so that there's a unity, an essential unity to the cosmos as a whole, and in particular, the earth and all that transpires upon it is ineluctably linked to the influence of the stars, to the revolution of the spheres, to the cycles of the moon and the sun and the seasons. The whole cosmos is present in the soul of the earth. And I think scientifically that's evident, that's true. I mean, you look at the form of a flower even on a visual level, and it reflects the form of the stars. And it's very familiar in many ways how the being of the earth and its seasons is nested into the whole of the cosmic universe. We have a very simple and powerful name for that unity and that reality. It's what we call nature, which is, on the one hand, a very simple word that, and reality which everyone recognizes and understands, and yet on another level, as far as its essence and spiritual character is concerned, it's of course a profound mystery. And another matter, back to the problem of human experience. Of course, on one level, we are part of nature and continuous with the events on the earth and the whole earth. However, in another sense, we could say that an individual life only arises in the moment that in some way we are set apart from the whole and reflect one or another aspect of it in an individual center of consciousness, the locus of which is the discrete body of an individual organism, which precipitates out of that cosmic whole in the event of birth. We're precipitated out of that cosmic womb when we take on a discrete body, which then ultimately, especially if you were a human being, becomes a discrete center of consciousness and a reflective center of consciousness, ultimately, we hope, something that we call an individual or an I, an ego. And it is only, and I diagrammed that on the lower half of the page. There's a sense of the cosmic whole and kind of all evolving out of the utterly transcendent unity, which in Plotinus would be the one, and in other schemes might be God. And then there's this precipitation out of the whole, and I've labeled that embodied existence here, which is a kind of extrusion from that cosmic whole. And it's only when we get there that we come to what's really the individual subject of experience. And it's only in that realm that we have our existence as conscious human beings in the world. Existence has that nice sense of being set, apart. Existence. The Germans have a word Dasein, which is being there, somehow extruded from the whole. Now, the question is, of course, what is the relationship between our concrete human existence, and that would also be the existence of the psyche, and that cosmic whole that is the background of our being, at least in Hermes's understanding. What is the relationship between our individual human existence and this immense background? Well, that's, so to speak, the million-dollar question. And in a sense, it's a way of trying to put the very riddle of human existence, and obviously there's no simple answer, but a host of complexities that if I tried to address them all, would probably stretch this talk out from 4 hours to something like 40 years as a conservative starting point. Even so, my goal here is to try and make some sense of this scheme to give us some leverage in understanding the difference between the elegies and the sonnets. And in that context, I'm going to forge ahead with some preliminary thoughts about how to articulate the relationship between the world of existence and its cosmic background. First of all, a mythic articulation. I want to put out front that we have certain topoi, especially in the biblical tradition, in which there isn't a separation between human existence and the divine ground. What do we call that in a biblical context? It's the Garden of Eden, right? When there's no separation or very minimal separation between the divine world, God, and the human being and the earth. And the earth is not taken material form and separated off from the numinous whole, but is continuous with it. And then when there is the exile, the extrusion of the human being, the primordial alienation from that divine ground, what is the biblical event that corresponds to? It's the fall, of course, the fall of the human being, when we enter that separated world of space-time, of concrete existence, and a gap opens between human consciousness and the divine consciousness, between human and God. Now, that fall, certainly in a biblical context, is not necessarily irredeemable. We're exiled from God's immediate presence, but of course much of the purpose of biblical culture is to reforge that connection or maintain a connection between them. You heard that in the psalm. There's still a sense of the continuity and the availability of the divine. And that's certainly true in another context for Hermes himself. And I'm going to read now another passage of the mind to Hermes that conveys this sense of Hermes's, or the divine mind's, sense of how it's possible for the human being to reforge connection with the divine ground, because there's a supposition of an underlying unity there. And here's Hermes. So you must think of God in this way, as having everything, the cosmos, himself, the universe, like thoughts within himself. Thus, unless you make yourself equal to God, you cannot understand God. Like is understood by like. Make yourself grow to immeasurable immensity, outleap all body, outstrip all time, become eternity, and you will understand God. Go higher than every height and lower than every depth. That made its way into a song, didn't it? I don't know. Go higher than every height and lower than every depth. Collect in yourself all the sensations of what has been made, of fire and water, dry and wet. Be everywhere at once, on land, in the sea, in heaven. Be not yet born. Be in the womb. Be young, old, dead, beyond death. And when you have understood all these at once, times, places, things, qualities, quantities, then you can understand God. Well, great. Easier said than done. I guess if you have the Nous itself as your personal teacher, you have you're on the fast track. But I think for most of us, the division between the divine world and our own human existence is a little more intractable. Nonetheless, I want to indicate another grade of this thought of there being an essential underlying continuity between the cosmic ground and individual human existence. A different grade, though, because in this version, that cosmic ground, it's emphasized that it is even though it's in our world, it becomes hidden, and it becomes occulted, less obvious, the relation. And here I'd like to reference Joseph Campbell, because in his essays, the occult in myth and literature, Campbell tells us that the world's most ancient mythologies do posit an unseen order of unity abiding behind the veil of the human being's fragmented experience within the world of space and time. And here's a quotation from Campbell. Underlying this field of existence, this field of multiplicity, then, there is mystery. And this is the mystery of our being, the mystery of the being of the universe, the mystery of the being of all things. It is hidden, and the word for hidden is occult. Now, all experiences of the occult tend to suggest that behind the veil of this temporal spatial experience field of ours, there's a deeper, truer field, which now and then may reveal itself to us, or into which we may drop. The old mythologies of the primary stages of human development, and this would include Sumeria and Egypt, all these wonderful archaic cultures. The old mythologies of the primary stages of human development generally regard this hidden depth or power as immanent, actually resident within the field of phenomenal experience. So again, there's a thought of there being an essential continuity, but now that divine ground is more hidden. And in the same article, Campbell actually speaks about signs in our culture of a resurgence of this insight of the world's oldest mythologies. And under that, in Egypt, we could certainly include Hermeticism, one of the world's oldest mythologies. And one of the movements he cites in this connection is indeed Jungian psychology, with its emphasis on the archetypes, because one way of conceiving of the relationship between human consciousness and that cosmic ground that we've been speaking of is that cosmic ground persists in our minds and souls as the various strata of the unconscious, the archetypal unconscious. Okay, so continuing on, it might be possible to recognize these two worlds as continuous, and yet at the same time for the sense of the gap between them to widen, the difficulty of accessing that numinous ground becoming that much more distant or difficult. And this kind of provisional dualism, which I'll call it, is a view that informs a wonderful recent book by Donald Kalshed. Were any of you at Kalshed's presentation here? He was here not too long ago. Unfortunately, I wasn't there, but I've read this wonderful book, The Trauma and the Soul. And this wonderful book begins with this very theme, and I want to read the introduction of it to give another articulation of the relationship between these realms, very eloquently stated. Kalshed, the first words of the book. Standing on the deck of our Newfoundland home at sunset on a summer evening, I am suspended between two worlds. Behind me, through the screen door, I can hear the Canadian television announcer describing the latest suicide bombing in Kandahar, Afghanistan. 29 dead, 50 wounded, blood and body parts plastered on surrounding walls. I can hardly bear to listen. Before me, to the south, lies the wild Atlantic Ocean, its undulating swells crashing into the cliffs of Skirwink Head, the day-dimmed stars slowly blinking on through a deepening azure sky as the last seabirds make their way across the horizon. The tremulous cry of a loon echoes across the water, and over the extraordinary beauty of this gentle scene, a distant foghorn blows its soothing benediction. Held in this beauty, my soul feels at home, and I am at peace. These worlds seem incommensurable. There are two worlds, and I struggle as I try to hold them together. The first feels profane, filled with human tragedy and the mind-numbing suffering that comes with mortal, embodied existence in a violent, polarized world. This world presents me with a fragmenting reality of human conflict. And the second world feels sacred, beautiful, boundless, and eternal, opening into an ineffable mystery that soothes the soul, into what Rudolf Otto called the numinous dimension of human experience. How do we manage to live a life full between these two worlds? How is it possible to live an ensouled life without bypassing the realities of human suffering on the one hand, or discounting as mere illusion the reality of those infinite and ineffable mysteries that the poet Czesław Miłosz calls the second space on the other? How do we maintain our dual allegiance? How do we honor our citizenship in both realms? Good question. So a third thought of the relation, a thought of still more radical separation, of secularization and alienation. As both Campbell and Kolsched, although in different ways, intimate, the traditional goal of spiritual culture, be it the myths and rituals of an archaic society or even modern psychotherapy, is to foster a vital connection between the individual and that sacred cosmic ground of being, however that numinous dimension of experience is interpreted or named. But we are not all privileged like Hermes to be tutored by divine mind. And for better or for worse, in the course of Western history, there's been an increasing concentration on the autonomy of the individual human subject. Traditional spiritual culture in the guise of religion has lost much of its hold on culture. And I think that's in part because the dominant strains of religion came to worship a transcendent God that became cut off from nature and the cosmos, so that their nature and our experience could not act as an effective mediation of the divine to the human being. And science, on the other hand, which began in reverence for the cosmic order, even Newton was a mystic of sorts who saw the divine logos embodied in the revolution of the spheres, has devolved in its classical form, although of course the pendulum is swinging back the other way now, to being wedded to a materialistic philosophy which disputes the existence of any kind of reality other than the material, and in which a world in which we have not even a duality of worlds, we simply have the world of material existence and the human being enthroned for better or for worse, and we see a lot of what the worst part of that equation is today, with all the kinds of planetary crises that afflict the human being. The human being operating as its own master as it conducts its business in a world that's regarded as largely soulless or purely material. This is, in fact, the situation that's characteristic of modernity, in a way, this sense of there being a disenchanted cosmos, this post-Nietzschean, God is dead, post-Darwinian world of the alienated human being. One signature of modernity, more or less at its advent in the dawn of the 20th century, is existential philosophy, which is a very interesting and compelling philosophy, which begins, however, with an acknowledgement that the cosmos does not supply connections or source of meaning for the human being, so that the human being is left by their own heroic vices to conjure meaning out of what is essentially a cosmic void. Names of Sartre and Camus are familiar in that context. Well, how then do matters stand with Rilke? As a writer living and working at the dawn of the 20th century, Rilke was born into this post-Nietzschean, post-Darwinian, discarded universe. Rilke was, of course, a lover and deep friend of Louis Andreas Salome, and a great deal of Nietzsche came to Rilke. He read Nietzsche himself, but even more came through his connection with Lou. And to some degree, Rilke certainly inherited the alienated state of the modern human being. Although he was born a Catholic, he became disenchanted at a relatively early age with the Orthodox forms of Catholicism. I tell much of that story in the book. So that he was, as is the classic situation, left to his own devices, spiritually speaking, to face the tearing divisions that are characteristic of a time-bound existence without recourse to an established culture of faith, or that could provide some coherent connection with the cosmic background, with the divine or sacred. This is certainly evident in the elegies, which does, I think, have existentialist undertones. Just think about the beginning of that poem, how it dramatizes human consciousness in its naked existentiality, how the speakers initially alienated not only from the divine reality represented by the angel, but as well from other human beings and, in fact, the world itself. That bare existence, Rilke tells us in 100 different poetic ways in the whole cycle of the elegies, is one that's mercilessly torn between the opposites, very Jungian theme. There's a debilitating duality that characterizes the subjective life that's thrust homeless into a foreign world where it's uncertain of its aims or ends. For instance, at the beginning of the fourth elegy, excuse me just a minute, to lubricate my voice. At the beginning of the fourth elegy, Rilke writes, "O trees of life, when will your winter come? We are never of one mind, unperplexed like migratory birds. Outstripped and late, we suddenly thrust into the wind and fall into unfeeling ponds. For while intent upon one thing, we always feel the draw of another." Or still more bluntly in the eighth elegy, "Always over and against the world, we perceive there only a mirroring of what's free and open, dimmed by our own breath. That's our human fate, being opposite and nothing else, always being opposite." Even so, Rilke's finally not an existentialist. That is, he's certainly not one who denies that there is a spiritual reality that informs the cosmic background of human being. If he despairs initially of his relationship to the angel, who's representative of that spiritual order, he never denies the angel's reality. Consequently, we could say that Rilke begins the elegies in a manner that's actually quite consonant with the kind of vision that Kolsched presents, that kind of provisional duality, a place of recognizing and lamenting the gap between the two worlds, the numinous or blessedly timeless world of the divine on the one hand, represented by the angel, and the tragically fallen world of fragmented space-time human reality on the other. And it's clear, too, that the ultimate aim of the elegies, no less than Kolsched's psychotherapy, is to forge a path of reconnection, to rediscover in some way the authentic relationship to that numinous ground of existence, what Campbell calls the mysterious occult order, hidden behind the veil of space and time, and yet, indeed, in some way immanent, concealed in it. Now, the formative principle of the very genre of the elegy is that the ritual act of lamentation, just as in more archaic forms of mourning, can itself provide a means of redressing the experience of loss and of disconnection, and can help towards restoring a relationship to that larger whole within the space of individual soul consciousness. That grief work or lamentation is soul work that through recognition of a primal void opens a space that allows reestablishing some connection with the sacred. In the elegies, we could say that the poet initially finds himself situated in a fragmented, time-bound world. At the same time, the speaker of the elegies is in departure from that world and moving, albeit painfully and uncertainly, towards some form of reconnection with the cosmic whole. So the poet speaker in the elegies then is effectively suspended in the gap between worlds, in that gulf, at home neither in the world of man, nor that of the angel. That suspension, that in the middle of nowhereness, is not, however, static in the elegies, as it is, for example, in Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which also takes place under a tree. There's always the archetypal tree. But of course, I don't remember the names of the characters, but they're not going anywhere. That void doesn't disappear. They're stuck in that suspension, in that gap between human existence and Godot, God. But our poet hero is going somewhere. In the first part of the talk, I mentioned Campbell's models of the hero journey towards the center of the universe, and his understanding that that journey, to boil it down to its bare essentials, involves three phases: departure from the common reality, initiation into a deeper spiritual truth, and return. So we could say then that the elegies do reveal the poet in departure from conventional reality, but that's not the full extent of it. I mean, that departure is inscribed all over in the elegies. Rilke's always taking leave from common degrees of relation and love or experience. But that's not the whole of it, because the plunge into the abyss that's enacted in the elegies is also quite clearly a process of initiation. The portal of initiation is always some kind of death of egoic consciousness, right? It always involves some kind of nigreda, which breaks the iron bars that normally confine us within the bounds of ordinary consciousness, ordinary reality, and open us up via an experience of some order of nothingness, which underlies our phenomenal existence to a greater whole. And that is the case because knowledge of death, of the non-being that underlies the world of becoming. Remember, in Hermes' scheme, the world of becoming is the world of life and death, becomes effectively the portal to all higher levels of existence. There first must be a recognition of the nothingness that underlies the separateness of the individual before reconnection to a whole, the cosmic whole, can be achieved in any wise. Now, if you doubt that the elegies and the long travail involved in their writing, remember it took Rilke a decade to complete them, really it entails a true initiation, entails, that is, knowledge of death, as such is ineluctably intertwined with life itself. Listen to this passage, which appears already towards the end of the very first elegy. For those of you who have the text, it's line 68. True, it is strange to inhabit the earth no longer, to use no longer customs that have been scarcely acquired, not to interpret roses and other things that promise so much in terms of a human future, to be no longer all that one used to be in endlessly anxious hands, and to lay aside even one's proper name like a broken toy. Strange not to go on wishing one's wishes. Strange to see all that was once relation so loosely fluttering hither and thither in space. And it's hard being dead and full of retrieving before one begins to espy a trace of eternity. Yes, but all of the living make the mistake of drawing too sharp distinctions. Angels, they say, are often unable to tell whether they move among living or dead. The eternal torrent whirls all the ages through either realm forever and sounds above their voices in both. So, if the elegies dramatize departure from an alien prosaic reality and two, initiation into a deeper truth, what about the sonnets? Well, I don't think that's too difficult to figure out. As indicated earlier, the Orphic consciousness at the heart of the sonnets, I believe, represents our poet hero's ultimately arrival at and occupation of that vital center that hinges the world, if you will. The gift of the poem itself isn't so much like the elegies, a script of the process of initiation. It's more the spiritual treasure that's born upon our pilgrim poet's return to the world, the third phase of Campbell's plot. For return he does, for if the first sonnet finds Orpheus and us in a purely mythopoetic realm, the world of the sonnets to Orpheus doesn't remain one that is in any ways cut off or separated from ordinary experience. The cycle as a whole, even more than the elegies, includes many images of everyday things and experiences. Horses, flowers, balls, the rapture and disappointment of first love, statues in parks, neighbors, airplanes, mirrors, dogs, stars, the list goes on and on. At the same time, and this is crucial, those things in the sonnets are not presented in an ordinary light. Those ordinary things are presented in an extraordinary light. They are transformed because they're seen as infused with the one life that flows through the cosmic whole by virtue of the Orphic lyre that's located right at that point of linkage. visible things are revealed in their coincidence with the higher hidden order of being, with the invisible truths of soul and spirit. Now let's return for just a moment to the elegies, because that transformation of reality, which is necessarily at the same time a transfiguration of the self, is naturally the aim of Rilke's elegiac lament from the beginning, from the first despairing lines of the great Duino cycle on to its last, more affirmative tones. And it's natural enough that it is in the late elegies that we find a very precise glimpse of that goal of transformation. In a famous passage of the ninth, that is the second to last elegy, Rilke writes, "Are we perhaps here just for saying, house, bridge, fountain, gate, jug, olive tree, window, possibly pillar, tower, but for saying, remember, oh, for such saying as never the things themselves hoped so intensely to be. For these transient things understand when you praise them. Fleeting, they look for rescue through something in us, the most fleeting of all. Want us to change them entirely within our invisible hearts into, oh, endlessly, into ourselves, whosoever we are. Earth, isn't this what you want? An invisible re-arising in us? Is it not your dream to be one day invisible? Earth, invisible. What is your urgent command, if not transformation? Earth, beloved, I will. Yet if the elegies attain to articulation of the vision, it's above all, as Rilke himself indicated, the sonnets that realize it. If by virtue of that initiatory process, that purification, that sublimation that is carried through in the elegies bring our poet to the threshold of that mysterious center of the universe that Campbell calls the world navel. It is Orpheus who we find stationed there under the tree of life, singing poems that in fact reveal that, as Hermes teaches, and although here I'm going to run the pattern in reverse, the world of becoming is in time, time in the cosmos in the eternity of being we honor as the seat of divine presence. Because Orpheus, again, is a god. That's not to say, however, that Rilke's Orphic vision elides all difference or distinction between the two worlds we're talking about here, or that the poet's more fragile human voice is entirely and unproblematically subsumed into that Orphic divine tone. The difference between the transient world and the numinous one is not entirely elided in the sonnets. It remains in effect. The difference isn't erased, but it is repeatedly spanned. And the poet's human voice acknowledges a significant gap between the power that he's willing to claim as his own and that of the Orphic god. In the third poem of the cycle, the poet images the instrument of song, the Orphic lyre, as that which constantly spans the gap between timeless being and our phenomenal existence. But he acknowledges, too, that this power is by no means within ready human reach. And here's the third sonnet to Orpheus, first part, one of my favorites. A god is able, but how, tell me, do mortals follow through the narrow lyre? Our sense is cleft. At the crossroads of two heart paths, no temple bears Apollo's fire. Song, as you teach it, is not desire, not wooing something finally attained. Song is being. The God's nature is gained. But when will we be? When will he inspire earth and stars to bend around our being? This is not it, youth, that you love. Even if your voice poured peons from your mouth, sing and forget that you sang out. It will end. True singing demands a different breath, a breath about nothing, a gust in the God, a wind. So that divine being embodied by Orpheus is not readily within reach. And yet, at the same time, unlike that initially terrible elegy angel, it's not so unreachable either. For the poem itself does indeed sound forth from that magical, unheard center. And throughout the poem, the poet's own breath isn't always clearly distinguishable from the divine breath, the spirit wind that inspired him to write 55 sonnets in the course of a few weeks. So, well and good, but the crucial question remains. We've spoken about Orphic song as spanning the gap or bridging the gulf between the worlds, but how does it do so? Can we, that is, dare to delve into the heart of that mystery and venture to say something about how and why the lyre works its potent magic, the nature and efficacy of Orphic song? Well, perhaps we might do so, but to do so, I think we need to invoke once more the deity to whom this part of the talk is dedicated, for who might help with the secret of this movement between worlds, but the God of passages. Who was it, after all, oh poor tortoise, that originally invented the Orphic lyre? First given as a gift to Apollo, Orpheus's mythic father. Who is that? Hermes. So in an essay on Renaissance Hermeticism and Western esotericism, the pioneering scholar Antoine Favre, how many of you know of Favre's work? He outlines 4 principles that are fundamental and indeed definitive of the Western esoteric tradition and the Hermetic philosophy that I think qualifies really as its chief current. And I'd propose that each and every one of those tenets can readily be seen as not only evident in the vision that underlies the elegies and especially the sonnets, but is intrinsic and absolutely essential to it, precisely because it is Hermes who, like those ancient herms erected to mark crossroads, and from which he derived his name, he stands at the transition between the worlds, and so stands invisibly behind the interrelationships of the cosmic order that Orpheus so beautifully sings. And here are Favre's, or Hermes' 4 founding tenets. Number 1, correspondence. Correspondences, symbolic and real, exist among all parts of the universe, both seen and unseen. What is below is what is above, and what is below is like what is above, and what is above is like what is below. We find here the idea, we find here the ancient idea of the microcosm and macrocosm. 2, living nature. Nature as a whole is a living being which can be read like a book and is considered to be permeated by an interior light or hidden fire circulating through it. 3. Imaginations and mediations. These two notions are interconnected and complementary. This is all favor. Imagination is considered here as an organ of the soul, permitting access to different levels of reality. It functions in conjunction with mediations of all kinds, such as rituals, symbolic images, and mandalas. In this context, the important thing is considered to be not what one believes, but what one sees, what and how one imagines. 4, and last, the experience of transmutation. This term refers to the belief that people and parts of nature as well may undergo a modification of their very being. This notion often has a bearing on the need for us to participate, listen to this, in the process by which the universe is born and moves towards its fulfillment by undoing the ravages wrought by the fall, by reforging this connection. So in a rough and ready way, it's not too difficult to see how these principles enable the bridging of the gap or the spanning of the worlds affected through Orphic song. The doctrine of correspondence establishes the two worlds as analogous and so inviting relation. The principle of living nature, well, that establishes the cosmos itself in a way that is not established in certain strains of monotheism. The cosmos itself, the whole of nature, and not in it so much in its outward appearance, but in its living essence, as instinct with divinity, as the numinous ground of existence, so that creative activity correspondent to nature may be, in fact, a redemptive gnosis. As far as imagination, well, simply put, this is the creative activity that realizes, rediscovers, and renews the relation between the worlds. Transmutation, simply put again, this is the effect of creative imagination, which entails a transformation of both self and world. So much for this very brief sketch of the theory of these Hermetic tenets. In the last part of the talk, we're almost there, we'll look once more concretely at how these founding Hermetic tenets infuse and inform the world of Rilke's sonnets. I want to close this part of the talk, though, with a Rilkean riff on the last principle, that of transmutation. Addressing the earth in the elegies, Rilke writes, as we already hear, "What is your urgent command, if not transformation?" The language of the sonnets is still simpler and more direct. Wolle die Wandlung, will transformation. Is that Rilke speaking? Or is it Orpheus? Whoever it might be, I'd venture to say he took the words right out of Hermes' mouth. Good. Okay, so let's just take a very brief 5 minutes so that we have time then to wrap it up with Eurydice. And we've made it through the heavy going there. Congratulations. Okay. So the third and last part of this talk is dedicated to Eurydice. And before addressing the inscription of those Hermetic tenets we talked about in the text of the sonnets, or rather, what I hope will be a fit means of doing so, I want to turn our attention finally to the third member of our archetypal triad, Orpheus's beloved other, Eurydice. You know, as his myth tells us, Orpheus himself is initiated into knowledge of death, the ground of phenomenal existence, through his relationship with Eurydice. In his most, and we heard this in the earlier poem, the Orpheus Eurydice Hermes, from the in his most human aspect, from the side, so to speak, of existence, of a life emptied by the loss of love, Orpheus descends to the underworld to recover soul, descends into the realm of death, which is the portal to the other side, the whole invisible spiritual world, the deeper levels of the archetypal unconscious. Just so, Rilke himself couldn't really progress in his quest for deeper truth, couldn't even finish the elegies before his heart was moved by the tragic destiny of Vera Ukama Knut. And by the way, the subtitle of the sonnets to Orpheus is written as a grave monument for Vera Ukama Knut. So it's the sonnets to Orpheus written as a grave monument for Vera Ukama Knut. And of course, she all too soon had to travel to death's realms, as is recorded in the 25th sonnet of the first part. But you, oh, and I should say before I read this poem that Vera was a very promising young dancer. I think I mentioned that. But it was also the case that as her disease progressed and she could no longer dance, she took up music, which was less physically strenuous. And after that, art. So there were kind of degrees of artistic expression which were less strenuous as her body gave out. Sonnet 25. But you, so swiftly departed, you whom I loved like a flower, whose name I did not know, you will I once more remember and show, lovely playmate of the unconquerable cry. A dancer first, whose body's sudden pause froze, as if youth were cast in bronzed art, mourning and listening. Then, from higher laws, music fell into her transfigured heart. Illness was near. Already caught by shadow, her pulsing blood darkened. Still, as if all might go forward, it pressed on toward its natural spring. Seized by dark stutterings, more and more it gleamed of earth, until, with horrible pounding, it stepped through the desolate open door. This poem, the penultimate poem of the first part, qualifies as Rilke's most explicit acknowledgement of Vera, but the memory of Vera deeply informs, I think it's fair to say, the cycle as a whole. And correlatively, the Orpheus of the sonnets can only be who he is, a god and to an image of the self with a capital S, because this Orpheus, unlike the earlier one in Orpheus in Eurydice Hermes, is in fact conjoined in a mystic marriage with Eurydice. Accordingly, the masculine side of Orphic being that's one with being, consciousness, cosmic harmony, is united with a feminine side associated with the emptiness of non-being, with the unconscious ground of existence, the ebb and flow of life, the mortal body of the world, and the power of creative imagination that depends upon an almost virginal receptivity. And this marriage, this conjunction is evident in a myriad ways in the text. For instance, it's explicitly recognized in the central 13th sonnet of part 2, which includes these tellingly beautiful lines. Be forever dead in Eurydice. In praise of things ascend, singing, back in the pure relation. Here in the realm of decline, amidst fading creation, be a ringing glass that shatters even as it rings. Be, and at the same time know the fathomless fount of non-being, the unending ground of your inner vibration, that you might wholly accomplish it just this once. there's so much in this fragment of the poem. Be forever dead in Eurydice, be and at the same time know the non-being, which the poet says is the unending ground of your inner vibration, of the music that Orpheus makes. The conjunction between Orpheus and Eurydice is also evident in the pairing of poems, one centering upon a masculine figure and one upon a feminine figure, that begins and ends each of the two parts of the poem. That is, the first and second poem and the second to last and last poem, and each of the two parts are paired in that way: masculine, feminine, feminine, masculine, masculine, feminine, feminine, masculine. We've already looked at the first and third poems of the first part of the cycle, so let's look at, for a moment, at the important second poem of the first part, where Eurydice puts in her first veiled appearance. Sonnet 2. And it was almost a girl who emerged from the consonant pleasure of song and lyre, and shone clear through her shady spring attire, and made her bed within my ears deep drum, and slept in me, and her sleep was everything. The trees I always marveled at, those palpable distances, the deeply felt meadows, and every wonder that touched my human being. She slept the world. Singing, God, how did you perfect her so she never sought awakening? See, she arose and slept fast. Where is her death? Oh, will you invent it now, this theme, before your song burns out? Where is she sinking away? A girl, almost. The second poem, paired with the very first one, based on the image, has a pride of place in the cycle. And remember that originally Eurydice is a sea nymph. And Carl Jung talks about how the figure of the retreating or ever disappearing nymph is an archetypal image of what Jung calls anima. And in this poem, the poet is clearly evoking just that, his anima, his soul, which, however, and this is really very important, is not really his. It's not something possessed by or contained in him. In fact, it's more the other way around. Look at that second stanza, an amazing one in the poem. The poet here really asserts that the anima or soul consciousness contains not only his human mind and all its marveling about things, and by the way, that line, every wonder that touched my human being, I talk about it in the introduction in the book, is a reference to Augustine's Confessions, a moment where Augustine is wondering about the nature of mind and memory. Anyway, at that point, the poet is asserting that the soul consciousness contains not only his mind, but more than that, the world itself. And so here, there's an imagination of all reality as within soul, within the unconscious, because sleeping life of soul, a life that's here not only a life because it's also a death. It's an unconsciousness open to spiritual realms, an imaginal soul space and time within which the poem itself and everything within it is contained. So here we're really touching upon and rehearsing one of James Hillman's favorite themes, one of the founding motifs of his archetypal psychology, which, as Hillman says, puts soul at the center. In his book, Revisioning Psychology, Hillman traces the central idea of his psychology back to the Renaissance and to Marsilio Ficino. That same Ficino, of course, responsible for the translation of the Corpus Hermeticum and the circulation of the ideas contained in that founding text. Speaking of the Renaissance, Hillman writes, and here I quote, Ficino was the formulator of its central idea. This was soul, and for Ficino the soul, and here Hillman quotes Ficino, was all things together, the center of the universe, the middle term in all things. Now Rilke's sonnets, which are of course a Renaissance form, convey a very deeply kindred vision. If Orpheus, as I propose already in the first part of this paper, sings from that universal center, his music echoes through nature and in our own hearing because he is joined or conjoined there in that center by a feminine presence, vira cum Eurydice, or the other way around. We've read the second and second to last poems of the first part of the cycle already. Let's listen for a moment to the penultimate one, number 28 of the second part of the sonnets, in which we find Eurydice there in the center of the universe, with Orpheus effectively. Oh, come and go. You, still almost a child, fill out for a moment the dance figure to a starry sign of one of those mild dances wherein we fleetingly transcend the sure, dumb order of nature. For she'd stirred herself to listen, and that's nature, the she, for she'd stirred herself to listen only then, when Orpheus sang. But you, still moved by the song you'd once heard, were a little surprised if a tree chose to hang back from joining you, going by ear. You still knew the place where the lyre lifted, resounding, the unheard center. For this, you attempted those lovely steps there, hoping to catch the glance of a friend, inspire him to hear the perfect celebration, and enter. The friend here is, well, it's anyone really, including, of course, Rilke, the poet himself. And though it may seem as though we've not really noticeably progressed toward the goal of revealing Febvre's principle of Hermeticism at work in the sonnets, I hope the contrary is in fact the case, because this discussion of soul is actually key to those ideas. Take, for instance, the principle of correspondence. To relate one thing to another, you need a middle term. Thus, the system of correspondences that comprise the Hermetic cosmos depends effectively upon the ubiquity of soul, its presence in all things, all grades and levels of reality. That the world of Rilke's sonnets is indeed a Hermetic world of such correspondences is well illustrated in the fifth poem of the second cycle, which focuses on the beautiful anemone flower. Again, this is the fifth poem of the second part. Flower, does everyone know the anemone? It's a beautiful wildflower. Yeah. Flower muscle, slowly opening the anemone's own meadow dawn until the polyphony of heaven is singing open-mouthed in that light-filled lawn. O muscle of infinite reception, taught within the still blossom star, often filled with fullness up so far, sunset's summons is almost naught, to fold bright petals so far unfurled back into you, you power and resolve of how many worlds. We're stronger and more lasting too, but when, in which of all these lives are we so open, so receptive, heaven's wives? I think this poem makes clear that the Hermetic dictum, as above, so below, is gloriously in force in the sonnets, the anemone flower taking in the heavens, and it does so in a manner in which the anima dimension of soul, although here it's no longer personified as a girl or dancer, but as a flower, remains present and essential to the means by which earthly nature receives and reflects and incorporates, and not in just a purely passive way, a heavenly reality. And while we're speaking of nature, the poem that we just read offers a brilliant instance, too, of Febvre's second principle. For in fact, all the principles are really closely interwoven one with the other. That second principle being that of envisioning nature as a whole, as a living being, which can be read like a book and is considered to be permeated by a hidden light or interior fire circulating through it. Rilke's sonnets are really a far cry from what we usually consider nature poetry, but then not all nature poetry is Hermetic in inspiration. And what image conveys the sense of that hidden light or interior fire circulating through nature better than Rilke's description of a rose with its profligacy of petals, folded petals, as, and here I quote, raiment on raiment arrayed round a body composed of nothing but light. And given that today is the spring equinox, or yesterday, how can we pass up sonnet number 21, 121 of the first part, which takes the Hermetic teaching that nature as a whole is a living, and that means ensouled being, which can be read like a book, a step further. For in this poem, not only is the earth the book, she's also the living being who is doing the reading. And here's sonnet 21. Spring is come again. The earth is like a child who knows by heart so many poems. Was it worth her hard labor? She wins a new start. Her teacher was strict. We liked the white in the beard of the old man. Now the blue and the green, can she recite them by name? She can, she can. Lucky earth, on holiday now, play with the children. We want to catch you, cheerful earth, and the most cheerful May. Oh, what she learned, so many things, what's printed in roots and what slowly grew in long, patient stems. She sings, she sings. Febvre's own explication of his third principle, imagination and mediation, itself ties it directly to soul. Here's Febvre. Imagination is considered here as an organ of the soul, permitting access to different levels of reality. It functions in conjunction with mediations of all kinds, such as symbolic images. And of course, it's hardly difficult to find a sonnet that illustrates this theme, because they all do. The whole work is one of pure imagination. But I can choose one or two that are especially commensurate with some of the leitmotifs that I've been stressing in this presentation. For instance, the 9th poem of the first part. Only he who can raise his lyre among shadows returns the unending praise, knowing what he knows. Only one who with the dead ate of their poppy will hear what's softly said and keep fairest copy. Even when the reflecting pool blurs and is dumb, know the image. In the domain of the dual, voices first become mild, eternal. In another, so to speak, Hillmanian moment, this poem associates the imagination, the power of the soul that creates images, with the underworld, which is, of course, associated in the poem with Eurydice, and, too, with liminality, because the poet in this poem identifies the image, very nature of image and imagination, with what he calls the Doppelbereich, which I've translated in the poem as domain of the dual. But more literally and actually more properly, it's one of those moments where I go back and see what I've done, and dual is not quite the same thing as double, but there it is. The Doppelbereich doesn't rhyme with whatever I was trying to rhyme with. But anyway, Doppelbereich more literally means double realm. And it refers to that mysterious place between the two worlds we've spoken about so much in this talk. That place that's really a passage and linking one to the other, life to death, time to eternity. And the difference between double and dual is that dual implies two things that are somehow separated, whereas double implies that they are one and the same thing or intrinsically linked. So it is a Doppelbereich. Remember that. And one last example of the power of imagination at work in the sonnets is sonnet number 20. And what's interesting about this one especially is not only that it's dedicated to one simple perception of a horse, but also what Rilke does with it at the end, which indicates that the very act of giving image to something is a consecration, a religious act in effect. Sonnet 20. And I could say too that this poem derives from an actual experience Rilke had when he visited Russia, and this would have been over 20 years before the writing of the poem. And he visited Russia with Lou Andreas Salome in 1900, and they had an experience with a schimmel, a white horse, who was bounding over the fields, and he remembered it all this time. And after over 20 years, this poem emerged. And the master referred to is Orpheus. But what shall I offer to you, master, say, tutor of creatures, song's soft source, my memory of a single spring day, at evening in Russia, a horse. He came from the village alone, all white, on one front fetlock the fetter, to be on the meadow alone at night. How his mane beat better and better, time upon the neck held high, despite the rudely constrained gallop. Oh, how that stallion's blood sprang up. He felt the open spaces nigh. He sang and heard. Your myth circle, sayer, closed in him. His image, my prayer. How and what did that silent white horse sing? Well, I'll respect the gesture and leave the filling out of that image to your own imagination. And as far as Febvre's final principle, that of transmutation, is concerned, in the first part of the talk, I already alluded to how this principle is clearly at the heart of the sonnets and is virtually identified with Orpheus himself, who for his part is one with life and death, the life and death of ever-changing nature. And here's the first couple of stanzas of the fifth sonnet, which identifies Orpheus with transmutation. Raise no memorial, only that the rose bloom each year for his sake, for it is Orpheus, his metamorphosis in this thing and that. We shouldn't take pains over other names. Once and for all, it's Orpheus when it sings. He comes and goes. Isn't it already much if his dying notes fall sometimes a short while after the rose? And yet in this section dedicated to Eurydice, I want to remember too that Rilke might not have ever written the sonnets without the inspiration of Vera Ukama Knoop, and that the principle of metamorphosis or transmutation is implicit in the art of dance, perhaps more than in most any other form of art, more visibly at least. For the essence of dance is constant metamorphosis, continual transition from one form to another. And so let's look finally at a sonnet that celebrates transformation in the guise of dance. And it's worth noting here that the permutation of the dancer's physical form here are only the first register of the world of transformation that's effected in the performance of her art that is also his art. Because, as befits the Hermetic cosmos of the sonnet, the figures the dancers perform, the dancer performs, reach far beyond the limits of her body, so that the dance itself becomes, as you'll hear, a microcosm, again, Hermetic term, of the larger universe, reflection of all of nature, a tree, the cycle of seasons, the rays of love emanating from the sun. All of this and more is offered to us in the poem. So as I read it, listen closely, and perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of Vera and something of the deep mystery at the heart of the not so small miracle she inspired. And this is the 18th poem of the second part. Part 2, number 18. Dancer, transposition of transience into the flow of your form, how you offered it there, and the swirl at the end, this tree made of motion. Did it not fully capture the far-flung year? Did not, so your just finished swinging would whirl round it, the crown suddenly bloom with stillness? And over, above, wasn't it sun? Wasn't it summer up there pouring down the immeasurable warmth of your love? But it bore too. It bore your tree of ecstasy. And not these its tranquil fruit, the striped urn growing ripe, and the vase even more fully? And in the drawings, the dark stroke of your brow, swiftly sketched on the face of its turn, can we not see it, even now? So now a bit of a coda to bring the three sections together. So towards the beginning of this talk, we spoke about this image a bit from Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes, in which each figure is detached in his or her own world. Orpheus, a man still belonging to a life driven by desire, a life in some ways cut off from death. Eurydice lost to the underworld, and though he's ostensibly there as their guide, Hermes is not in particularly close connection with either one of them, as is dramatized by the failure of the journey, the breaking off of the connection, again, when Orpheus looks back. But did Orpheus, in fact, fail? Was his looking back indeed a fatal error? Or could that gesture perhaps be read differently, as even in some sense deliberate, even in some sense heroic, in the best and truest sense? After all, isn't it hard to imagine Orpheus succeeding in a conventional way, that is, not looking back, so that Orpheus, the soul, would resurface to resume her place at his side as the woman, indeed the wife, at his side, so that the couple might live happily ever after in the real world? Is that really what the best conclusion would be. Psychologist Robert Romanishin, who follows Maurice Blanchot in this, does see this all rather differently, views, in fact, Orpheus's backward glance as indeed a deliberate gesture, as the means by which the self aims to take conscious note of the abyss of non-being and unconsciousness that underlies it. The moment in which life takes the measure of death and is forever changed and transformed by that fateful knowledge. Is this perhaps the consummation of a true initiation, or at least the threshold of that? Is this the pivotal moment that enables ultimately, after the grief work, after the elegiac lamentation of loss, the real sacred marriage, the true mysterium conjunctionis? So what I've said already in all three parts of this talk, I think, do suggest as much, and suggest more too. For while the greater conjunctio manifest in the sonnets, which is the end station of Rilke's own long path of alchemical soul-making, does premise itself upon the union, the marriage of Orpheus and Eurydice, these two cannot really meet except by way of a third. Mythologically, Hermes is related to Hymen. And even if, as Rilke says in the sonnets, at the meeting of two heart paths, there's no temple for Apollo, no external structure of worship, that is, we nevertheless indeed expect to find Hermes, the original god of intersections, who, as I've said, acquired his very name from the Hermes place to mark crossroads, would expect to find him present at the marriage of Orpheus and Eurydice, just as he was present as guide and escort in the passage between the worlds, where, despite the apparent failure, they perhaps truly forged their most intimate, authentic, and lasting connection. So then, do we in fact find Hermes present in the sonnets? Well, nowhere does he appear in the poem as he does in Orpheus, Eurydice, and Hermes. That is, as a discrete figure by name, a character in the dramatic scene. But I'd propose that that's not because he's not present, but rather because, as I've indicated, the scene has shifted. We're picking up the action, so to speak, after Orpheus has not only loved and lost, but looked and lost again, and lamented that loss, and even been torn apart, dismembered by the maenads, so that we are listening to, what we're listening to is not only the song of the deathless lyre, but also the unstoppable song of the immortal head that accompanies that lyre down the river Hebrus, which sings in and through all of nature, birds and trees and lions and stones. And here's the last sonnet of the first part, 126. But you, divine one, you who sang to the end when the maenads attacked in scorned throng, you overcame their riot with order, sweet friend. Out of destruction rose your uplifting song. None there could hurt your head or your lyre, no matter how they raged. All the sharp stones they flung at your heart, fierce ire, softened upon the touch of your harp. Furious, mad for vengeance, they tore you apart. Yet your voice echoes on in birds and in trees, in lions and stones. There you sing still. Oh, you lost God, you endless spur, only because you were scattered by enmities, are we now the hearers and a mouth for nature. And where is Hermes then in this scene? Where is he in the text of the sonnets? Where is he in nature? Well, the gist of this talk is that he is nowhere, nowhere in particular, because he is everywhere, woven into every line of every poem in the way Orpheus sings and the imaginative way Rilke sees every meadow, every tree, every flower, every child playing outside a church in Spain, everything on earth. If Orpheus and Eurydice are one in the poem, one even if two, they are two, one with the one who invisibly joins them, Hermes. This is a second way to see Orpheus, Hermes, and Eurydice, not distracted and detached as in Rilke's earlier poem, but connected, even conjoined. And I'd like to close by moving towards the suggestion of one more way of seeing this triad. It is, in effect, the midpoint between these two other ways of seeing them, a way that retains the distinctness of each character that's so pronounced in their fateful passage between the worlds, and at the same time sees them as far more closely connected as they proceed on their way toward the later scene of Rilke's sonnets, and perhaps, too, towards us. This third way that I want to see them is a historical way. And to sketch this scene, the vision, I'm going to draw on Chris Bamford's book on the esoteric tradition, a book which borrows its title, An Endless Trace, from Rilke himself, and has a picture of Orpheus by Redon on the cover, the head and the lyre. Now here's Bamford. The third and fourth chapter of the book deal respectively with Hermes and Orpheus. And before I read, I should make clear that what Bamford gives us to understand is that in their primordial forms, Hermes and Orpheus's teaching are very deeply kindred. They both promote an idea of knowledge as a kind of gnosis, a participatory seeing into the nature of things, a vision that presumes an essential correspondence between the visible and invisible worlds, sense and spirit. And Bamford then rehearses how in the course of time, it became already with Pythagoras, already with Plato, there was a tendency to separate the knower from the known and to objectify the object, a trend that ultimately led to the disenchanted view of the universe characteristic of modern science, with its absolute division of subject and object, which is of course breaking down in the paradigm of the new sciences, and indeed is characteristic of modernity in general. Bamford calls for a revivification of that more integral vision characteristic of the Hermetic and Orphic origins of the esoteric tradition. And here's Bamford. Original Orphism harked back to and held the promise of something different. Orphic meaning and experience are one in the sense object. What a thing is, its meaning, is revealed in the perception of it. Through sense images, think of Rilke's poem on the horse, which are names, words, songs, the gods are spoken. Knowledge is concrete, something seen, witnessed, lived. By the time of Pythagoras, meaning and object were already coming apart and the gods were growing silent. Meaning seemed to be moving to another dimension, and as it did, the senses were more and more seen to betray and mislead. It's the story of Orpheus again, the Urgesang aller Wesen, the archetypal story of all beings, as Herder called it. Orpheus lost the world, the beautiful soul of manifestation, and descended after it into Hades, the granulated world of birth and death. He failed in the version taught in Greece to raise her up, but he forever holds the promise of so doing, of reuniting mind and nature, being and becoming, humanity and the universe. He presents the possibility of a non-objectifying perception and imaginal thinking. This is to return to art, the speaking, disclosing, embodying of truth, as the origin of culture. So picking up on Bamford, I want to leave you with the suggestion that, as the second and third part of this talk implied, that the philosophical or theoretical strains of the tradition Bamford talks about has been carried forward in history, most consequentially by Hermes, patron of alchemy and astrology. Orpheus, in the meantime, has become more identified with precisely art, with the magic and music of poetry and song and the other forms of arts, and with the soul of love and the love of soul embodied in his relationship to Eurydice. So if we typecast our characters in this way, seeing Hermes as Hermetic philosophy, Orpheus as poetry, and Eurydice as, well, Eurydice is the soul in general, but also by definition, if we trust the word, the subject of what's been called psychology. So if we see them in this way, the stage for my third middle way of seeing our trio of figures is set. In that tableau, I see the loss of soul that manifests in Western history in a myriad of guises, including the repression of the feminine. But it's the mission of Orpheus, of art and poetry, to feel that void, to know that loss, and to strive to bring soul back to the world, not by prematurely wrenching Eurydice back out of the underworld. Could Rilke's sonnets bring Vera literally back to life? But through the initiation of that backward glance, coming to soul, to know soul in a different, deeper, more truly loving wise. Yet the creative imaginal thinking that must be at the heart of that effort itself requires a guide, itself requires remembrance of the intrinsic interconnectedness of all things that indwells the being of soul itself, requires the memory of a harmony of the cosmos that's inseparable from the beauty of the world's soul. It requires, that is, Hermes. And so in this vision, we might see the wisdom of Hermetic philosophy guiding Orpheus, the archetypal poet, as he in turn leads soul back into the world, or perhaps more accurately, brings the world back to soul. But who is leading who? It's not so much the order of the figures that's important, for they are all intimately connected, three distinct aspects of one cosmic whole. What is important is the path that they take together, and that the way they may, perhaps, lead us. Thank you. Well, we made it. And we have time for questions. If there are any, I know it's a lot to absorb, so you can catch your breath for a moment. Yes.
Could you explain in any of this understanding that divine presence is also connected to experiencing the suffering?
So are you asking? Yeah, certainly that's a profoundly important part of Rilke's Odyssey. I go into that in great length in the chapters on the elegies in my book, in which the elegies stand to the sonnets, so to speak, as the crucifixion does to the risen Christ, if you were to make that analogy. And I talk in the book about how suffering and the pain of loss um, is a mechanism of purification that ultimately engenders reconnection with being. If I tried to do that subject justice in the framework of this talk, it would be twice as long. This talk focused a bit more on the sonnets than the elegies, and the suffering is really dramatized, more powerfully in the elegies. But it's a hugely important point that the affirmation that is finally reached in the sonnets, and then the tranquility that you see in that, the first poem and that scene, and which really remains in force throughout the sonnets, which do not really speak in that kind of agonized human voice that the elegies speak in. That's an achievement that comes only after the tremendous work of suffering, that is worked through in not only the elegies, but also Rilke's novel, the Notebooks of Malta Lored's Brigge. And so it's a hugely important aspect of the mythic journey of Psyche. I mean, in the book, I read Rilke's whole career kind of on the model of the myth of Psyche and Eros. And the suffering of Psyche once she's lost love, and the travail is integral to the way that the space of the soul that's capable of connecting with spirit and not being blown up by it, is hugely vital. So yes, it's a point very well taken. But I thought it being spring and this being dedicated to sonnets, we could, for a change, leave, because this talk really is focusing on, in that it kind of centers on the sonnets. It is focusing on a vision, as I tried to imply earlier, that is the end station of a long career. And it's, to me, the miracle of the sonnets is that it's not talking about how you get to that conjunctio, that final, that stage of the realization of the self. It's offering a vision of the self and the world as experienced through a realized conjunctio, a realized self-image, God image. And that's something we rarely get. And so, I mean, you don't hop over the prior, Rilke didn't hop over the prior, 51 years of his life and go straight to the sonnets, far from it. But it's worth, when I give talks and presentations on Rilke, I inevitably get bogged down in the early phases because I want to cover anything. So this time I went straight to the end. Yes?
So would you say then that he experienced through the sonnets, and you portrayed in the sonnets, that he had a mystical consciousness then? Or would you go that far?
Yes. Why not? I mean, now whether, I mean, the sonnets were a kind of revelation. I mean, you look at the circumstances of their composition in which Rilke writes them in such a short period of time. Now, to the degree to which, and the elegies too, in their inception and their completion. I mean, these are works that come from inspired states of consciousness. The degree to which Rilke himself, the individual, in his own conscious being, was able to fully embody the truth or wisdom which he produced, well, that remains somewhat open, to question. I mean, to some degree, the dedication, his lifelong dedication to the vocation of poetry, for which he takes a lot of flack, that he didn't go to his daughter's engagement because he was working on the elegies, I mean, there is a lot of criticism of Rilke that he shirked normal human duties, which should not be shirked in pursuit of his poetry. But be that as it may, he got to some very special places and gave the gift of that achievement to us. Yeah. Yes. Well, let's go here and then we'll. we'll go here and then we'll.
Well, I'm really grateful that you're here. This is so amazing to me, even though I only have a slight idea of what you're talking about.
We're all in the same boat there.
Well, I get the kind of general principles.
Yeah.
So my question is, how would you compare and contrast Rilke with the more modern poet known as Bob Dylan?
Wow. I don't really know enough about Bob Dylan to say anything intelligent about that. Does anybody else want to venture a response to that? I mean, Dylan is a great lyricist. I mean, they both have an inborn lyric genius. But I wouldn't presume to I can speak on Rilke, but on Dylan, someone else might know a little more than I on that subject. Anybody have any thoughts on that wild comparison? Yeah, very different worlds. I mean, you know, Rilke, in a way, is the quintessential European. He didn't have much interest in, he never visited America, unlike Freud or Jung. He never had much interest in America. His interest in the English language was pretty rudimentary. He was not like other great German authors who, for instance, looked upon Shakespeare in dramatic circles. Shakespeare's looked at as almost German because he's in some way the father of German drama. He was so beloved and translated by Schiller and so forth. Rilke didn't have any kind of that relationship to the world of America or to language of English, close relationship to French, somewhat to Italian, Russia, even Arabic. He did translate with help Elizabeth Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese, which is amazing. And you read Rilke's the first translation, you know, of the first poem, and you think translations are never as good as the original, and that's a pretty damn good poem, you know. In the original, how many? I'm going to butcher it, but you know, it's the famous one about "Let me count the ways." And you read Rilke's German, and it's phenomenal, you know. So as a translator, he's as a translator of sonnets, he's pretty remarkable in that respect too. But their worlds are so different, so I can't really venture an intelligent response to that. Let's have the question back there. Wait for a moment. Let's.
As you were speaking, I was reminded of one of the elegies, and I think it's I live my life in growing orbits, move out over the things of the world.
That's the second poem of the Book of Hours, actually a much earlier work. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across all things. I may never attempt the last. I may never complete the last one, but I'll attempt it even so. That poem, right? Yeah.
Right. So I was just struck by. It seems that, you know, we're further along at this point, or
right.
we're further along in his, I don't know, development.
Yes,
that
definitely.
is how he was thinking about this. And
yeah.
I was just struck by this sort of call, you know, this kind of distress and in what you just read, and then here we are in the sonnets,
right.
where it seems that there's much more of a completeness and a wholeness and sort of a peace in his writing.
Yes, well, I think that's true. I mean, the Book of Hours was the result, that first book of monastic life. Book of Hours has actually 3 volumes, but came out of Rilke's trips to Russia with Lou Andreas Salome in 1899 and 1900. That poem was actually written as the first volume of that, the Book of Monastic Life, which was written between the 2 trips to Russia. So at that time, Rilke's 25. And the Book of Hours is a wonderful, wonderful, ecstatic, in a ways, text. it is definitely earlier Rilke because it's pre-Negredo in a way. It's pre all the life crises which Rilke suffers. That particular book of monastic life, already by the later volumes in the Book of Hours, the last one's called the Book of Poverty and Death, Rilke has been lost Lou. He's been married and divorced. He's poor, and he's already begun a descent into darkness. But the Book of Hours is a wonderful, youthful exhalation which has a kind of innocent relationship with God, with his image of God, that is nonetheless deeply informed by icons and other aspects of the Russian tradition. But you don't have the encounter with suffering and with death that Rilke subsequently lives through. And so you do get a different stage on the soul's path. Again, I sketch it out in my big book, which I go through all the stages of Rilke's soul journey. And the Book of Hours is so deeply connected too with his relationship to Lou and her psychology of religion. Her ideas about religion are crucial in that book. But it's also true that in that early Book of Monastic Life, he sets out the poetic mission, saying, I want to sing the names of things, that is finally culminated more than 20 years later in the elegies and the sonnets. So he's very emphatic, too, that there is a continuity, there is a unity to that vision. There's still, but the filling out of the individuation process is takes place over the course of the next 20 some odd years.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Are there any questions perhaps from our... Nothing online. Okay. Well, if that is all, I want to thank you. I can't believe that I'm finishing early. I think that must be the first time in my life I ever spoke on Rilke and I finished early. I want to thank you all very much for coming. And as was mentioned, the books are available. Even if you have translations, even if you have 7 translations of the sonnets already, get mine. It's a different poem in a different translation. It's not the same thing. There's a special discount price if you get the big book and the sonnets. You can get a special discount for that too. So thank you all.